My parents were part of that great migration to the cities that took place after World War II. We had relatives who still lived in the country, and visits to the family farms were highlights of my time growing up. But now in retirement, and given my experience as a diocesan rep and now as board president of PWRDF, I am beginning to understand more about how growing food can be so much more than an exercise in agricultural economics. It can be something that lifts the human spirit and enriches our community life. In 2013, I was invited on a learning tour to Cuba with a group from PWRDF. We met with Bishop Griselda Delgado of the Cuban Episcopal Church and heard how in 1989, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, so did the food supplies to Cuba. Their food was dependent on subsidized imports from Soviet countries. We heard heart-wrenching stories of people left without food and left without hope. Seed stocks and breeding animals were consumed. Hunger and starvation became a reality. When Bishop Griselda was still a parish priest, PWRDF supported her and her husband in community development training. As famine gripped the country, they took what they learned back to their parish to start something they called renewing spaces. They planted crops on the church property to feed their congregation, while teaching their parishioners practical skills like cooking and how to preserve the food that they grew. As food was grown, it was shared with neighbors, the elderly, the unemployed, and school children. This spurred locals to offer up unused yards and fields near the church, which could be put into crops. The church taught the theology of taking care of creation, especially the soil, so that food production was sustainable. In Cuba, there's a saying, "We borrow our land from our children." Hope and faith in the future were renewed as communities started working together to feed each other and to care for the most vulnerable. This was more than an agricultural revolution. It was a spiritual awakening. In 2014, in another PWRDF delegation, I visited a Canadian Food Grains Bank project in Manitoba, not far from the farms where my uncles lived. Our host was a third-generation farmer named Will. He and his neighbors found a field, planted and harvested it, and passed the proceeds on to the Canadian Food Grains Bank. PWRDF, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and Global Affairs Canada collaborate to use donations by farmers like Will to feed those who are living in areas where conflict, climate change, and other factors are creating food shortages and famine. When he was asked what motivates him, Will replied, "I love feeding people." For the past 5 years, my husband and I have been working as lay ministers in a small, largely First Nation community in Yukon. Climate change and wildlife numbers declining are a reality here, and I jumped at the chance to help instruct a local course on food security. We built raised beds and distributed seeds and helped people get planting in the spring. Not all the gardens were perfectly tended, but it gave me a chance to visit and check in with people as the summer wore on. As we look ahead to God coming into the world in the form of a helpless infant, we are reminded from the moment of Jesus' birth, he was placed in a cattle stall, surrounded by farm animals and agricultural produce. Food feeds our body and our soul. Loving our neighbors as we love ourselves involves feeding others, even as we feed ourselves. Something the Primates Fund has been helping us to do